The British government promised me in Karachi they would intervene on my behalf. It's now more than 3 years, with many scars, both physical and perhaps deeper psychological. But I hope that the British people will hold the British government to its word. I want to get out of this hellish cell and back to my home on Goldbourne Road.
Since we're looking at a 20-minute time slot, what I'd really like to do with this group, I think, is just take a little bit of time to go through the 3 major positions that the U.S. government has been taking about the torture practices that it's carrying out in Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, all over Iraq and all over Afghanistan. But there are really 3 basic positions, and I think when you examine any of those 3 positions, they completely fall apart. And in doing public educational activities, I think it's really important to deal with each of those 3 positions, because it's what people in the general public hear all the time. And it leaves people really, really confused. They're just not sure what to think. And if we don't deal with those and give them the information, they tend to be much less self-confident about doing stuff with us. The first, of course, is that the U.S. government says it was just a few bad apples. Every now and then soldiers get out of control and do bad things. Maybe that happened in Haditha, for example, but it's certainly not government policy. And we certainly never allow it, and because we've court-martialed those young MPs and justice has been done, we're great guys. You know, it's not policy. And certainly all the files that have come out through the declassification campaign, all of the Amnesty and Human Rights Watch testimonies that have been taken from the prisoners, the lawyers coming back and saying what's happening to the prisoners, statements by FBI agents who were horrified by what the CIA is doing, and so on and so forth, make it clear that it is policy. We have documents signed by Mr. Rumsfeld saying, well, I stand 8 hours a day, why not the detainees, for example? I mean, all of that was specifically authorized from the very highest level. So why do they keep saying it was just a few bad apples? Because if they can get away with that by saying it over and over, then they can duck out of the command responsibility, which would mean that the people at the top, probably President Bush, for whatever executive order he initially signed, it still hasn't been declassified, definitely Rumsfeld, Cheney, Alberto Gonzales, all of them have to be indicted for war crimes trials. You know, really that has to happen. So that's why we keep hearing that it's just a few bad apples. Actually, exactly 10 years ago, 1996, I was sitting in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee panel about my husband's torture and murder in Guatemala by people who were working for the CIA. And I heard exactly the same thing. The panel said at the end of my testimony, this is a disgrace. No one should have to go on a hunger strike and nearly die out in front of the National Palace just to stop torture. This is a complete disgrace. There was a few bad apples over in the CIA, a few rogue operators, and it will never happen again. So some of us saw some irony in these Abu Ghraib things. The second position, of course, is that it's completely legal one way or the other. Maybe it wasn't quite torture, but in any event, they're not covered by the Geneva Conventions because they're enemy combatants. And that's ridiculous. And I can go through just a couple of the statutes and international treaties that do cover them. And then the third position, of course, is even if it's illegal, even if it really is torture, you have to let us do it, because what if there was a nuclear bomb just about to go off under Grand Central Station, the great ticking bomb? And we keep hearing all these stories right after, and certainly I heard it on NPR radio the day after September 11th, that this, as if this had really happened, all these different stories on NPR and all the different radio stations. And a few years ago, I tried to track those down one by one, and it turned out they were all hypothetical. It's never happened. Smaller versions have happened where maybe policemen could stop a small bombing in Gaza or something that could kill a few people. But the story of the great railroad station where people lined up 3 suspects and shot one of them and the other one talked and the world was saved, that's never happened. It was complete fiction. So going through those one by one, the different techniques we're seeing used on all of the people that are being detained today in the war against terror not only are used uniformly wherever the U.S. is, but they go all the way back to U.S. activities in Central and Latin America and also Vietnam. Actually, the CIA has developed those torture techniques for a decade and refined them. Originally, what they were trying to do is develop the perfect truth serum, quote unquote, and they experimented in the 60s with LSD, handing it out to some of their own staffers, including Dr. Olson, a scientist who then jumped out the 10th floor of a hotel thinking he was losing his mind. Others think he was pushed, in fact, so that he wouldn't talk, but in any event, they decided to cancel that. And a lot of the actual drugs they tried to use turned out to make people sort of as if they were drunk. They would talk more and more and more, but not more truthfully. So they were trying these other things, and a lot of the torture things that they started coming up with, they got from the KGB, like sensory assaults and sensory deprivations and combinations thereof. But just by way of example, to show how far back all of these techniques go, the iconic photograph, and I've got a bad shoulder, I can't lift my arm up much, but the man in the hood with the wires on his hands on the box, that's called the Vietnam position in U.S. intelligence circles. It's where it was originated. When the Afghan convoy had all of those, I think more than 1,000 Afghan prisoners being shipped from one prison to another after the prison uprising in Afghanistan, nearly 1,000 died because they were packed into hot metal shipping containers on the backs of trucks with no water and no air holes. And they're still buried out in the desert and unmarked graves. We heard from the CIA that, well, we didn't know about that. That was that Afghan warlord that did that. That's sort of a technique for torture that's traditional with Afghan warlords, and we didn't know anything about that. They then turned around and shipped John Walker Lind in a hot metal shipping container a few days later. In Iraq, that's a punishment. We are holding prisoners in hot metal shipping containers on different prison grounds as a form of punishment. The extreme heat, basically we're leaving them to bake in the sun. Colonel Ann Wright, who has left the military after a 30-year very illustrious career in protest of the war in Iraq, says, yeah, I stopped that in Grenada. I came across U.S. soldiers doing exactly that, and I made them quit. I was the local attorney, and I told them they couldn't do that. Nothing new. The extremely hot and cold temperatures, a Viet Cong prisoner was held in what was like my husband, was thrown out of a helicopter because he didn't give good information. The waterboarding we keep hearing about, where the CIA says it's not really torture, we just dunk the guy's head underwater till he, quote, thinks he's going to drown, kind of like a pool dunking. In fact, Otoniel, for example, and also Mario, and also Maria Guardado, and quite a few other people we have at TASSC, were waterboarded in Central America. And not only were they waterboarded, they had a North American come in and ask questions and supervise their torture in many cases. You've all heard that in Diana Ortiz's case, with the State Department and the CIA saying impossible. None of our people would ever know where a death squad cell was. In fact, it was common. I've documented 20 of those cases in my most recent book, Truth, Torture, and the American Way. I asked Otoniel just before I went to Geneva to the Committee Against Torture recently to write me a little description of what waterboarding was like, because I wanted to convince the committee that really was torture. He said, yeah, they held me underwater, and I started drowning, and the water started scrambling around through my brain and went up my nose, which was really painful, and then I thought my eardrums were going to burst, and then I went into convulsions and started vomiting in the water, and the next thing I knew they were giving me CPR, and then they drowned me again. So I read that affidavit to the committee, and they decided that waterboarding would be banned, which I was very pleased with, from the mouths of the survivors themselves. The dog attacks we saw in Abu Ghraib, those were used on Sister Diana Ortiz and Inez Murillo, who also the CIA admits that one of their people, Mr. Mike, was going in and out of her secret prison, taking testimonies and getting information. She was also kept in stress positions. For her, the helicopter, where you tie the person's hands and feet behind their back and suspend them from the ceiling. And I said, was that really stressful for you? And she said, yeah, it dislocated my shoulders. How many more? We have the case of Hector Anaya in El Salvador, who was a human rights leader for the Church Commission on Human Rights. And he was just forced to stand in a police basement for about 30 hours. All they did was make him stand. And of course, Rumsfeld, when he says, I stand for 8 hours a day, tended to forget that he's allowed to move around. He's not kept in a fixed position. And that the lymph, by keeping the person in a fixed position, can't be passed back through the body. And in fact will cause enormous pain and swelling, can even cause kidney failure if it's extended. His wife, through a family connection with the military, found out that he was being kept in that basement and that there were North American military advisors in that basement too. So she sent her lawyer over, who did basically a huge fight with the American military person, who finally said, okay, you can see him. I mean, this was headline news that this man had been kidnapped and that everyone was looking.